Hello friends! First I want to say thank you because my last video about outlining the book I'm working on, I did not ask you guys to give me suggestions because I thought that that would just be like a pain in the butt if I asked you for suggestions and then half of them I was like, that won't work, because that's what happens when you ask for suggestions. But you gave me unsolicited suggestions and some of them are really good, and I now really feel like between the work I did on my own and then like all the things I thought through. In fact, it was amazing how often like one person would suggest something and that didn't quite work, but then somebody else would suggest something kind of similar but different, and then that would make me think of the other person's idea and how like neither of them will quite work, but like if you take elements from both of them. Anyway, that was cool. I didn't expect that at all. I'll definitely keep telling you my plot lines if I'm stuck. But some of the discussion in that video comments was about my magic system, and that got me thinking. I haven't done a world building video in a while, and I love talking about world building. So I haven't done one on magic systems, and I thought that would be really fun to talk about for just another chill video for the Cozy November Writing Challenge month. And I'm probably going to take off next Wednesday because it's like almost Thanksgiving, and I haven't always been posting videos on Wednesdays anyway. They usually have been Thursdays. Part of that is because I now spend what feels like 1,000,000 hours a week going to the post office, which isn't, it's only a couple extra hours. But my post office is closed indefinitely ever since Hurricane Helene, and now we have to drive to a whole other town to ship out eBay packages, and it feels like it takes up so much extra time because, you know, it's like a set schedule thing where you have to make sure that you get things out the door before the post office closes and make this drive. And actually, before Hurricane Helene, I didn't even usually have to go to the post office. I just handed off the packages to my boss. So now he's not there because the store's gone, the post office is gone. Anyway, my schedule has just been a little mushy, and I guess it's going to be like that forever. Anyway, only one video next week. That's the point I've been rambling toward. But enough of that. Let's talk about magic systems. Yay! Usually the first question that seems to come up when it comes to magic systems and world building is it a hard magic system, meaning it has very strict rules about how it can be used, what it can do, etc., or is it a soft magic system, which is a little more loosey-goosey? But I want to start with a totally different question. When I started talking about world building, the first video I did was, what kind of world builder are you? And I keep coming back to that question for myself whenever I'm dealing with my world building, trying to decide exactly how things work, what to keep and what to toss and what to focus on, is why do I enjoy world building in the first place, and what part of it is so compelling to me? And for me, the number one thing is like sociology. How does society develop and react and all of that? So when I'm thinking about like what I want magic to do and what part of it is interesting to me, my favorite part is what effect it has on society. And for you, this might be totally different. Like, one of the people in my local fantasy writer group is a biology professor, and all of her books always have some really cool way of incorporating like plants into the magic because she knows a lot about that, finds it interesting. So first thing you might want to think about is like, what is your reason for developing a magic system to begin with? What do you want it to do in the world? And also, like, what kind of themes really resonate with you and that you keep coming back to again and again? And how does your magic play into those greater themes in your story? And these are probably not questions that you would get to when you're first sitting down to develop a world. So, you know, admittedly, maybe the first question you want to ask is your magic system hard or soft? How does it work? Stuff like that. But just, there are a lot of videos that talk about that part. So all I'm saying is at some point when you get a little deeper, maybe you're, you know, on a rewrite of your first big fantasy novel, or you're a little deeper into your role-playing system, you might want to think about how magic plays into themes and your interests and specialties. I feel like when I'm thinking about a magic system, there are a couple of rules that I want to always apply to any magic system in any book. And one of them, of course, is that there should be some kind of rules. Even if it's a soft magic system and you're a little loose on how it works or what it can do, you still want the reader to sense that there's some kind of limitations on it. Otherwise, the story is going to be chaos, which maybe the rule is that there are no rules and that the world is this crazy anything goes, chaotic world. But that in itself is kind of a rule that you would want to establish early on, that, oh my gosh, magic is just like run completely wild in this place. Usually, though, there's like some kind of rules. Maybe a lot of rules, because magic can get out of hand very quickly. And there's also that thing whenever you introduce magic that's almost impossible to avoid, where powers scale up and down based on the importance of a scene. Like somehow someone's powers are somewhat depowered early in the book when they're dealing with lesser stakes, but then when they face the final villain, suddenly they're able to pull something out that's like, were they able to do that all along? Or is it just like the power of love right now? And I know that I'm always trying to like remember the logistics of keeping magic realistic, but it can be so hard to make sure that everything's really realistic when it comes to magic, that I also feel like you can relax about it a little bit, because there are plenty of satisfying stories that just embrace the scalable powers, so it might not be important to keep everything realistic, in all honesty. The other thing I like to bear in mind is that if you have magic users, if people are the ones creating the magic, then they're probably developing their magic to solve a problem. But it seems like whenever a society solves a problem, they cause a new problem. And that's something that I always like to play with. And I think that whenever you have magic, it's always fun if you think about what problem it solves and what problem it causes. And that is something that I think you can think about pretty early on in the world building process, just in a general sense. What are the ramifications of people being able to use this magic or cast this spell? And then you have all the nuts and bolts stuff of how it fits into the world, how does it work with the balance of power politically? How does it work with the balance of like gender roles, family roles, different classes? Who is able to learn magic or is it innate? And, how does that affect the world? There's a lot of those basic questions. I'm not going to get into them in like great depth of like the checklist, because I feel like there's a lot of that on the internet and in books. Like there's a lot of resources if you really want like a whole list of all the things that you could be thinking about. But, usually when I'm developing a world, it's a little more organic than that. There's just certain beats that I want to hit, like making sure that makes sense and, making sure that I've considered how it fits in with things I actually like to write about. So in my own world, I was thinking about, is it a hard or a soft magic system? And I think that it is somewhat of both, and also that it has become harder over time. And that's kind of one of the things that's interesting to me about it. So the basic types of magic, and it will not surprise you to know that these can be traced back to my teenage influences that I've talked about 1,000 times: ElfQuest comics and Final Fantasy games. One of the two main races, the Miralem, are innately telepathic, and the telepathy works very similarly to the ElfQuest comics. So you can really see the ElfQuest DNA with the telepaths. They can sense emotions, they can speak to each other across distance, they can read minds if they have enough ability, they can sense out things that they can't see, they can sometimes, if they have enough power, they can levitate an object or, manipulate the physical world with their minds, and they can shape flesh and heal and cause pain. All these things related to like manipulating the body. I think the only thing they do in ElfQuest that my characters can't do is they can't shape wood and metal and rock. with their telepathic powers. That is the domain of elemental sorcerers. And another way it differs from ElfQuest is that in ElfQuest, like, some people are born with a very particular talent, like they're a healer. It's kind of an innate thing, and that's like the one extra thing they can do. Whereas in my world, it's more of like anybody can theoretically do anything, but there's like a broad scale of how much telepathic ability you're born with. It could be a really pathetic amount of telepathic ability where you can barely even kind of defend your own mind from invasion, or maybe sense things around you a little bit and maybe talk to someone like in the same room with your mind. Or you can have people that are just like almost godlike powers, though that is very rare. So that's telepathy and telekinesis that only the Miralem can use. Then there's elemental sorcery, and this is where it gets more like Final Fantasy, because in Final Fantasy games you learn spells and a lot of them are elemental, and then you can also go to the potion shop and buy like a potion or like a, a spell that just is like a one-time use attack spell. So my world also kind of works like that. And the magic is powered by crystals. There are crystals in the ground that kind of make everything theoretically magical. And then if you actually have a crystal in hand, that enhances your power even more. But anyone could, in theory, become an elemental sorcerer, whatever race you are. All that requires is like spending time out in nature, out in the elements, and like getting in tune with them, and then learning slowly how to work with them, manipulate them, and eventually you could, do pretty much anything that involves manipulating the elements. And that requires kind of like what's on hand. But then you have potion makers, and potion makers is where the magic gets a little more soft, because potion makers can kind of figure out spells for anything that seems convenient to the story. Like, the potion makers are who figured out how to make doll people and animate them and make them look lifelike and kind of work like a real person. They still needed a telepath, though, to call the soul into the body that they created, but they can create a whole body that like works like a real person to an astonishing degree, where they can speak without lungs and think without brains and, feel things with their skin, and, they work like people. Somehow, potion makers did that, and the idea is that it took them a very long time to figure out how to do that, and then even longer to like refine it. Like, you get the idea that originally some guy just like animated some awkward doll body, and then over time they figured out how to make them move better and look better, etc. So that's a little like, okay, well, if they could do that, like what can they do, and what can't they do? Are there any limits? And I'm never gonna sit down and make a list of like, here's what all they could do and here's what all they couldn't do, because theoretically, I guess it could be anything that works for the story. I kind of have like an instinctive sense of like, that doesn't seem like it would fit, but I couldn't define to you what that really means. But the stipulation with a potion maker is that it takes a really long time to figure out how to manipulate all of these elements and ingredients and things and create like a spell. And then it's something that you would like write down in your secret spell book, like a recipe. It's more like cooking. Like, theoretically, there's always a new dish you could come up with, but you'd have to take the time to like tinker with it and figure it out. And potion makers are able to make magic that can be like shared with someone else, like a potion or a crystal that, does a thing, or a staff that's enchanted with a certain level of magic that could generate spells over and over. So they're able to make magic that like someone who's never studied magic could just carry around a bunch of spells and use them. Which also means that the magic of a potion maker is potentially it's a commodity. It's something that can be bought and sold, which is not true of telepaths and just elemental sorcerers. So that's why there is an entire business of creating and selling spells, and that's very important in the story. And then you also have necromancers. Necromancers are for the most part hard magic because they really usually only do a couple of things. They can raise the dead, or they can take dead body parts and kind of use them as like an organ transplant or a hand transplant, or they can transplant body parts from dead people by kind of bringing them back to life. They can create the spells that undead people need to take to keep them like living and not turning into like a decrepit zombie. And they can talk to the spirit world. They don't really do much else, so for the most part, that's also more of a hard magic system with a lot of limits. But there is one necromancer. Dormangara is the most powerful necromancer in the world, and he has one of the great crystals, so he kind of has access to like a deeper, older, weirder magic than any other necromancer. Which brings me to the other kind of soft magic, and that is ancient magic. In The Broken Queen, there's some discussion of this, how back in the day, there was weirder magic that worked with different rules than magic does today. And that in the current world, very few people know how to use this magic anymore. The King and the Queen of Dragons can use it, and the Keeper of the Dead, Dormangara, can use it, and there's like a few people who have access to this ancient magic, and sometimes you can find like an artifact that works in a way that doesn't make sense anymore. And that whole thing, it's very limited in the story because I want that old magic to always hold a sense of wonder in being somewhat out of reach, that it's kind of a magical thing that you would like to find, but you almost never do. It's like some amazing archaeological discovery where you read about something and you're like, wow, I want it to have that feeling. So my magic ties into themes that I like to go back to over and over. And this is something that just kind of come about organically as I've been writing the story over the course of 30 years. But even if you're developing a world for the first time, I think that it's worth considering how magic could feed into themes that resonate with you. So some themes that I keep coming back to, and by the way, when I was younger, I always felt like I needed to come up with a new theme for every story or somehow it was cheating. And if anybody out there has that conception, let it go. That's not how storytelling works. Just FYI. There's nothing new under the sun, and it's also perfectly fine to have like a theme that's you. In fact, your readers will probably like your book because they liked that theme, and if you continue that theme, that is actually kind of a good thing. So some of the themes that I've gone back to over and over again and how they tie into my magic system. Does absolute power corrupt absolutely? Is it possible to have someone who is extremely powerful, the most powerful person in the world, maybe, or the richest person in the world, or whatever, without them turning into a jerk? So when it comes to my magical system, I have people that have, not a lot of people, but I have people that are born into either through inheriting a crazy powerful crystal like Dormangara did, or someone who's just born with like a freakish amount of magical power, more than almost anybody. I have a few people in the world that are just like really overpowered. Where I like to take that is not like a superhero-ish kind of arc where they're, they have all this power and do I need to go fight with the power? It's more of like an inner question of, is this power turning me into an asshole? So that's something that comes up with my magic, is that you can be born with either a very small amount of power or a very over-the-top, excessive amount of power. But it's rare, but of course some of my main characters are in that position. Another theme that I really love is that of feeling like you're different from everyone else. And, well, not just feeling like you're different, but maybe like actually definitely being different from everyone else. And having to embrace those differences in yourself and in the other people you know who are maybe also different from you. And having to learn to fully embrace who you are and who all of your friends are. And learning how you can all help each other and, a very corny theme when I describe it like that, but you know what I mean. It's a real, you're the nerd kid that didn't fit in whenever you were around other kids when you were 7 years old kind of theme to write. So, hello. So a whole lot of magic in my world seems to kind of just exist to explain why people are so different from each other. Like, I have a whole race of doll people that are just kind of naturally somewhat outcast in society because they're not flesh and blood people, and they have to claw their way to some kind of equality over the course of decades, and that's like a big theme of the story. There's various points where sometimes, like, being a doll person is described as being a big advantage, and other times it's described as being a big disadvantage. Like, you're not inherently better or worse for being a doll person. There are some things that if you're in the right place, in the right mindset, you could feel like, this is terrible. I wish that I was a flesh and blood person. And you could also feel the total opposite. I have one character who starts off as a flesh and blood person, and he's killed, and he ends up having to become a doll person. And he thinks it's great because he doesn't have to eat or feel cold or feel much pain anymore, and he's like a workaholic, so just being able to work all day on like his passion projects without ever having to stop to eat is great in his opinion. And he feels like inherently doll people are stronger because if you have magic, all that physical stuff doesn't really matter that much. But if you are using magic, then having your body not feel cold or pain, you can really focus on the magic and nobody can kind of distract you that way. That's like a big advantage in his opinion. But then I have another character who starts out as a doll person and becomes a flesh and blood person, and she realizes that having a flesh and blood body puts her more in touch with like her magic, that she feels more physically strong and grounded and more able to use her magic. So like, depending on who you are, you could see it both ways. And I like playing with that kind of thing, how you can have something that seems like a difference that's a disadvantage or an advantage, depending on how you look at it. And when you have magic in a world, it gives you 100 reasons for people to be different from each other in some really crazy ways. Like, you can hear the spirit world talking to you all day, or your arms were shape-shifted into wings when you were a child, or you're a doll person, or there's so many. So I really like that part of magic, and it's one of the main reasons I write fantasy, probably, is just so I can keep coming up with ways for people to be hot weirdos. And then another theme that I love is thinking about the disadvantages and the advantages of the modern world versus the past. Is the modern world superior because everybody in the past was racist and violent, and they didn't have toilet paper, and clearly the present is superior and you shouldn't romanticize the past? Or in fact, is modern life a total mess because we're destroying the environment and we have way too much stuff and we don't go outside and we're losing touch with our communities? Those are just things that I grapple with all the time in the real world, and I enjoy trying to work through those questions, kind of like trying to figure out how I want to live in my current world and how much of the past I want to draw into my current world versus how much I just want to embrace whatever's coming. And I like playing with that in a fantasy world. It gives me like a somewhat detached way to explore those questions. So that comes up in my world a lot. And one way that it does is by having that sense that there was this old magic that worked in different ways. And you have some characters who really romanticize the old magic. And then as the story goes on over the decades, even the current magic starts to become more commercialized and commodified because, as I mentioned before, potion making, and when I say potion making, it's not just making potions, but actually any kind of magic where you put it in an object or you generate some kind of magical thing. That is a type of magic that you can commercialize. If you had 100 people who could all make this healing spell based on this recipe, pretty soon you could have basically a factory making a healing potion, and you could brand it. And you can also have a whole industry of people to make magic and get rich off of it. In taking anything that's inherent to being human or being whatever kind of magical person you are, is taking that thing and putting it through the engine of capitalism. What do we lose in doing that? Or do we gain something because more people have access to that healing spell than they did in the past? Maybe more lives are saved. On the other hand, you've kind of lost some of the more organic aspects of magic. You've lost some of the experimentation, the more human touch, the connections with nature. I like exploring things that feel really relevant to what I'm dealing with as a person through the lens of a fantasy world. So that's something that is worked into my magical system too. So now that I've talked about my world, I find this so fascinating. If you've developed a magical world, I would love to know, what are the things about it that you love the most? Does it work into your themes or things that you really are fascinated by? Does it feel relevant to things in your real life? Or do you have a totally different feeling about it? I'm sure that if your magic system was more driven by an interest in plants and how you could work plants into a magic system, for example, or an interest in mythology and how you could incorporate mythology into a modern magical system. You know, there's like so many different ways to play with it. And I think depending on what your type of world builder are, you're probably going to take like really different angles from me. Mine is obviously, it is a very like sociologist's way of creating a magical system and like thinking about a magical system. So I would love to know about your magical system. I always love reading the comments on these type of videos because it's just very interesting. Even if I don't have time to respond to every single one of them, I definitely do read them, and I love that discussion. And thank you so much for watching. My name is Lydia Foxglove. I am a fantasy author, and I've been a novelist since 2009. If you want more from me, I have a Patreon and a Substack. Same content on both. They both have free content, as well as the $5 tier gets you access to my Discord, bonus videos, and more. I've been doing streaming and sprinting writing with my Patreons every Sunday from 6 to 8 p.m. That's been a blast. So if you want to join us, sign up for that $5 tier and hop on in. I'd love to see you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next weekend. Bye!